Putin's paranoia is different from its Soviet predecessors. The growing official paranoia in Russia is based on a siege mentality, which is all too familiar to many of us who grew up in the Soviet Union. However, as Tolstoy might put it, every paranoid regime has its own brand of paranoia. Putin has long viewed the West as a cynical, transactional adversary, which is more akin to a gang boss being wary of rivals than the ideological competition that was still playing out even in the Soviet Union's final relatively vegetarian years. However, Putin's paranoia about his own people is getting close to Stalinist proportions. Evan Gershkovich, a reporter for The Wall Street Journal, was recently arrested, and travel restrictions have been put in place for high-ranking members of the regime. The official response to the bombing that killed pro-war blogger Maxim Fomin, whose online alias was Vladlen Tatarsky, is indicative of the latter. I watched the Nicholas Danilov saga unfold when I was in high school, and at first glance, the recent arrest of Gershkovich, allegedly for spying, seems eerily similar. In 1986, Danilov, who like Gershkovich was the son of Russian immigrants to the United States, was framed by a Soviet contact who had handed him an envelope containing classified documents while he was serving as the Moscow bureau chief for U.S. News and World Report. The KGB showed up promptly to arrest him, ostensibly so that he could be swapped for Russian intelligence officer Gennady Zakharov, who had been detained in New York a few days earlier. A fortnight and a half later, Danilov and Zakharov were both released to their respective embassies. The circumstances surrounding Gershkovich's arrest seem to be similar. Yevgeny Cherkasov, who had been studying in the United States under a false Brazilian identity, was indicted and arrested by American authorities just a few days before Russian counterintelligence nabbed Gershkovich. Putin's Kremlin has a long history of prisoner swaps with Western countries. Back in 2010, Russia received a group of Russian illegals from the U.S. in exchange for 4 people convicted of spying in Russia, including Sergei Skripal, whom Russia later tried to poison in the UK. Late last year, Russia traded U.S. basketball player Brittany Griner, accused of smuggling a tiny amount of cannabis oil into Russia, for arms dealer Victor Bout, who had been serving time in the U.S. Since Western leaders have apparently given up on negotiating with him and have settled on treating him as a war criminal, Putin may have concluded that hostages are his only bargaining chip. He assumes that because the West is open to trade, his enemies must also be. The tightening of travel restrictions for Russian government employees reported by the Financial Times' Max Sedin on Monday appears to be another Soviet throwback, but it is more likely motivated by this than by a fear of defections in the style of the Soviet Union. Since the beginning of Putin's war on Ukraine in 2014, police and other regime enforcers have faced restrictions on leaving Russia. Officially, the restrictions were put in place because of a widespread fear of unlawful arrests at the hands of Western special services. Putin sees anyone working for the regime as a potential hostage if they travel to the West, which was never the case in the Soviet Union. The Danilov case was extremely rare because Soviet authorities preferred to expel, not imprison, Western reporters. Involuntary desertions are probably not a major issue. No senior Russian officials or enforcers are known to have fled to the West more than a year into the current phase of the war in Ukraine, despite some of them having better chances to do so than their Soviet predecessors, particularly those with property, cash, and contacts in Western nations. Even for those who don't buy into anti-Ukrainian propaganda and are pessimistic about Russia's future, the dangers of abandoning the current regime outweigh the benefits. Thus, Putin does not appear to have any reason to suspect official disloyalty. No generals, governors, or government officials have been charged with treason since the massive invasion of Ukraine began, and the few dissenters among the Russian elite, most notably Anatoly Chubai, the veteran bureaucrat who was one of Putin's early promoters, have been allowed to leave the country. Putin has had no reason to instill fear in the regime's servants as a whole because they have readily submitted or remained silent. The average Russian is a different story. An estimated 5,000 people will be sentenced to prison time in 2022 for discrediting the Russian armed forces, for participating in protests against the invasion, most of which took place online. One blogger, for example, was sentenced to 8.5 years in prison, which is consistent with Stalinist practice. Most of the political opposition has been imprisoned or exiled, but the regime is still waging a brutal war, even against its own supporters. A powerful signal has been sent that the Kremlin is not interested in protecting these groups as its own, even though the pro-war opposition, which views Putin as too soft and too enthralled to his corrupt coterie, and the propagandists aligned with the Wagner mercenary army have been largely allowed to operate. The killing of pro-Wagner millblogger Tatarsky and nationalist activist Darya Dugina last year demonstrate, at the very least, that the Kremlin is more interested in capitalizing on their deaths for propaganda purposes than in preventing them. In the Dugina case, a Ukrainian woman has been accused of detonating a car bomb near the singer. In the Tatarsky case, a 26-year-old St. Petersburg woman named Darya Trepova has been arrested for allegedly giving Tatarsky an explosive-filled statuette during a fan meeting at a St. Petersburg cafe owned by Wagner mercenary army founder Yevgeny Prigozhin. Trepova asserts that she is the victim of a frame-up. Regardless, she was swiftly labeled a supporter of opposition leader Alexei Navalny's outlawed anti-corruption foundation by Russia's National Anti-Terrorist Committee, a government body coordinating anti-terrorist enforcement. As it turns out, police have used a leaked database of Navalny supporters to harass dissidents, and Trepova's name is included in that list. Nothing the regime has done so far comes close to matching the scale of Stalinist retaliation, which hit everyone, including the elite and especially high-ranking officials. Putin, however, seems determined to demonstrate to the country that he would go that route if confronted with more organized anti-war opposition than he is currently experiencing. For Putin, only the state and people who represent the state stand for Russia. All others are automatically suspect, even if they can be useful at times. This should give pause to the ultra-patriots and those close to Prigozhin. While Putin's paranoia may not be as horrific as Stalin's, it still exudes a sense of doom. The Soviet Russia I came to know was much more complex than a simple generator of evil, Nicholas Danilov wrote in a book chronicling his career as a Cold War reporter. Putin's postmodern improvisations on themes from the Soviet past probably leave his listeners feeling anything but optimistic.